Good morning, students. I am Dr. Seherrie, and I am responsible for TMS 3721. And this is just an introductory session, just to give you a little bit of guidance in terms of how you can do the assignment, our second last assignment that is coming, assignment 4. So I will introduce it, and I will also try to highlight certain concepts and some important theory that you need to know in attempting that assignment. Thank you very much. Yeah, our outcomes. Normally, I like to start with outcomes, because when we start a lesson, you normally have outcomes that you want to achieve. And that is how we have to be focused. So you want to achieve something at the end of your lesson. So the very same with this presentation. The first outcome is just to have a little bit of understanding of what is meaningful assessment. Then the second one, we will talk a little bit about feedback and the results of feedback. Okay, so those are our two outcomes for the session. And it is so important that we must always keep our outcomes in mind, so that we have a mindful progression as we continue with our lesson. Right? So in the first case, assessment must be meaningful. And if we talk about meaningful assessment, we actually say it must mean something to the learners. Learners must feel the value why they are assessed, right? Because sometimes we only do assessment for the sake of compliance. We know that there must be an assessment when it comes to the different types of assessment, like your informal or your formal assessment types. So in this case, I want to put your mind, or to focus your mind again on the real value of assessment. And it is also obvious that nowadays, except for our informal assessment, when we are looking or talking about our formal assessments, it is normally standardized. And when we talk about standardized assessment, it rather comes from a national level, from a provincial level, even from the district. And sometimes we also have the clusters, where schools are clustered together. Teachers come together, they set an assignment, and all those schools within that cluster will write that assessment. And that is what we call a standardized assessment. And in many cases, we'll find that it has now become mandatory, meaning that we are all compelled to write that assignment. Whether it is on cluster level or it is district level, we all have to write it. And that comes with a very valuable stakes. For example, now we allow our learners, especially when we have the mobility of our learners and of parents. When parents are moving from one district or from one town to another, it will be much easier for the learners to adapt, because it will be the same content where the learner coming from and where the learner will be. So the content in terms of our CAPS document will be the same. Now, if we look into the South African context, right, I have already explained the context. Why is it so that we have this type of standardized assessment? Why it is so important? And why has it become mandatory? We know that we have a very few incidents where you will find that at some schools, you will have those culprits that do not really want to do assessment. There's no evidence in the learners' notebooks, or there's only a few evidence in the learner's notebooks. And that is why parents have now stand up against this type of incidents. So to protect ourselves, this type of assessment has come useful, right? And it is very worthwhile, and it is fulfilling, and it is valuable. And that is within a small nutshell why it is so important. Now, if we look about to the teaching and learning cycle. Now, remember, if we talk about the cycle, there must be a place where we start, and then there must be an area or place where we end. So the teaching and learning cycle is actually the place of assessment. Where we teach, there is learning taking place, and at the end, there is assessment taking place. But assessment is not a once-off thing. It can be in some instances, but in many cases, it is a continuous process. So as you can start as from the beginning, when you start with that icebreaker, when you start with that introduction, that is where assessment immediately starts. You start, you try to determine learners' prior knowledge. What do they know? Do they know something about the content? That is how we start. So assessment is a continuous process, starts from the very beginning until the end. And that is also, it gives you an indication whether your learners is with you or not. Now, it is also an interwoven process. It is interrelated, right? So it requires intentional planning. So we cannot just do assessment. Excuse me. This assessment must be intentional. There must be something that you want to do, that you want to achieve at the end of the process. Now, if we can look to the cycle as we have stated, we first want to improve assessment, right? We want to improve assessment by our teaching and learning. And it is based on reaction. So we teach and we want reaction from our learners. Learners must respond. And then we can also ask ourselves the question, how can assessment, teaching and learning be improved? So after your first assessment, your second attempt, and so as you continue, you will then find out ways, how can I make it easier for myself in order to reach my learners? Then there must be certain considerations when you do your assessment. Remember that we want to test knowledge, skills, values within our assessment. Those components have to be, it must feature within our assessment. So whenever I look or you look to a lesson plan, you must immediately identify what is the knowledge, what is the new information that learners will learn now. What are the skills? What is it that they have to achieve at the end? So those are the things that we want to see in a lesson plan. So there are different types of assessment. Before you start the lesson, you can do maybe a baseline assessment. What do learners already know and what can they do? So that is the prior knowledge that we test. The prior knowledge that you want to determine how far am I? How far are my learners with the content? What do they know? Do they have a clue or not? How can I introduce or continue with my content? Now, during the lesson introduction and the main lesson, as you continue, that is why we said right at the beginning, you do a baseline. You determine. You want to find out about the prior knowledge. Then as you continue, as you go, as you outline the new knowledge, the new information, the new content, then what kicks in? It is diagnostic assessment, right? So now you find out what they know and how can you assist. So do learners understand what they are learning? Do they know? And if they do not know, you reflect, you go back and you explain again. You come up with new examples. You come up with fresh examples. You involve your learners. And that is how you try to implement this type of assessment that we call diagnostic assessment. Then, so the lesson continue. You progress with the new information. You go on. Now, at the end of the lesson, there's another type of assessment that kicks in. It is formative assessment. Now, formative assessment, we want to determine what is it that learners know by now. At this point of the lesson, at the end of the lesson, can learners apply what they have learned through this whole lesson? And that is where we come up with the formative assessment, right? Now, formative assessment in many cases can be formal or informal, right? You can even have an assessment where learners can mark their own. You can even mark a few scripts yourself, and that is how we can apply the formative assessment, right? So now we continue. How can learners with barriers to learning be assessed in an alternative way? So now we have another component that we must work in this assessment. So very important, we have to cater for those learners with the learning barriers, right? And on the opposite side, we also have to cater for the gifted learners, learners that is sharp, learners that is fast, and learners that are quick. So how can gifted learners be assessed to enrich their knowledge and skills? Continue. Why is it? When can we see whether our assessment is meaningful? I will only highlight a few concepts. It makes learning more meaningful. They link classroom activities with real life experiences. So there's a link between what learners are doing in the classroom and how they can associate that new knowledge with life experiences outside the classroom, right? So life experience come handy here, and the activities becomes handy, and the two must be linked. So learners must feel, oh, I know, I have experience about this. And that is how we say we want to link the activities. It must be authentic and relevant to the life worlds of students or to learners, right? Authentic, it means it must be original and it must be relevant. Learners must feel, okay, I like this one that we did the first time we do how to ride a bicycle, for example. And now there are certain steps how a learner must that the learner must follow in order to ride the bicycle. So a learner can now go and apply that knowledge outside the classroom, right? We also have the real world into the classroom. We make it practical. We make it learners must see, they must know, they must enjoy, and it must be intentionally. It must be deliberate and purposefully, right? So we must always have an intention. What do we want to achieve at the end of this lesson? Then it must be interesting, right? So it must be interesting to the learner. It must be challenging to the learners. And learners must also make the assessment their own. There must be evidence. Remember, with every assessment, there must be evidence. You must have evidence. There must be evidence in the learner's notebooks. So those are the kind of evidence that I'm referring to. And if you find that the learner did not achieve that outcome, then we talk about multiple opportunities. Right? So learners will get another opportunity to see whether the learner can achieve this outcome. And that is how we want to improve our assessment. We can also continue with it. It relates to the curriculum content. So where do we get our content? We get our content from our CAPS document. So the CAPS document, the annual teaching plan, is our guide. That is where we get our content. But the nicest part of the CAPS document is that we can play with the content within that specific quarter. So it is not rigid as it was in the past. Even if we have an interesting event that has to take place, if we can take the day of Mandela's Day last quarter, it was nearly in the beginning of the second week when we start. But you could have shifted that content to the beginning of it and makes it an interesting event. This is the very same whenever there are events at your school or in your community, and it is relevant to our content in the CAPS document and specifically in the annual teaching plan, within that specific quarter, now we are in quarter 3, you can take it, bring it to the front, and bring it to maybe the first week in that quarter, and you can start with that content. And that is how we can shift our content and make sure that, but within the quarter, I have to finish my content of that quarter according to the CAPS, right? Assessment must also be inclusive. Remember, we've talked about multiple opportunities. We've talked about learners with learning barriers. So this type of assessment, you must make sure that you build in information or content that caters for those type of learners, right? And we say it has to be challenging. Why do you, the educator, think assessment will stimulate the interest, right? So those are questions that we always have to ask ourselves. Are students familiar with the type of assessment? Did you as a teacher prepare them to undertake the assessment? So learners become only used to what we are used to doing in the classroom. If it is for the first time that we do a kind of assessment, learners will find it surprisingly. But as you continue, it become norm, it become a custom. Learners get used to it. Then you will see that learners also responded well to that type of assessment, right? Now, there are basic principles when we are talking about assessment. It is validity, reliability, fairness, meaningfulness, discrimination, and sustainability, right? So let's look in what is it all about this concepts. Now, if we talk about validity, it measuring what is intended to be measured, right? If I know I want to make sure that learners must be able to write their names at the end of the lesson, or they must be able to explain how to brush their shoes. That is what I want to achieve at the end. In other words, assessment should cover the content that is expected to be covered in alignment with the outcomes. However, educators should not be concerned solely about the validity of the content, but also justification. And here we are bound by SAQA that describes what is validity and how can we implement it, right? So we must test what we want to test. It must measure what is intended to be measured. So if I talk about maybe a mathematics sum, and I say I want to focus on 1 plus 1, that must be my focus. I cannot go and say I want to do subtraction now, but my outcome is about 1 plus 1, right? So that is very important. The second one is reliability. So, if you write a test, for example, or you have set an assessment in the form of a test. Now, what is reliability? What is it about that? It refers to the consistency of the assessment practice. And it means that if facilitators assess work independently, using the same criteria and marking scheme, they will get more or less to the same result. And we've talked about standardized assessment. If school A write the same test as school B, then at least learners who wrote that test must get to the same outcome. And that is why we say our assessment must be reliable, right? If you want to learn to teach about how to ride a bicycle, the learner at school Z, if it is a standardized test, the outcome will be the same for that learner in that school. So the basic question that educators need to consider regarding reliability of any assessment task is whether they have tried to minimize the possibilities of errors, right? So that is very important. We must try to look at that point. And then it must be fair. It must be realistic. For example, if we talk about language, we all maybe speak English in the classroom. So I cannot put in a language that no one of the learners do not understand on that task. So that is when it becomes fair. It is fair, and even the complexity, the level of complexity within that assessment, it must be within the range, and that is why we talk about Bloom's taxonomy. So we must cater for our level 1 and 2, for level 3 and 4, and we also cater for level 5 and 6 within that assessment. So that is when we can say that that assessment is fair, right? It is fair and it is realistic. Go to the fourth one, meaningfulness. Such a task has the potential to contribute to both teaching and learning, right? Now, if we talk about meaningful, something must be worth it. It must be worthwhile doing that assessment. So students, or even we ourselves as teachers, when we write, we have to do a project, for example. At the end of the day, we must feel it was worth it to do this project, because these stakeholders, like the parents in the community, have benefit, the school has benefit. Me, myself, I have developed certain skills. So that is when we talk about assessment has to be meaningful. Discrimination. To distinguish between learners who have acquired the knowledge and skills that are being assessed and those who have not. The quality of assessment should be able to distinguish or discriminate between able and less able learners who have the benefit from learning and those not, right? So we must all, at all times, look about discrimination. How can we make sure that we treat our learners fair? And how can we make sure that if I have a lot of resources to my availability, but I know school X doesn't have any resources, then I must now try to see, is this a part of discrimination? How can I avoid? How can I make sure that learners of school A and learners of school B will both benefit because they have the same resources? And those are also the things that we have to keep in mind when we set our assessment forms. So very, very important. Then the last one is sustainability. Right? Determines that assessment needs to satisfy the current future needs. When educators plan assessment, they should align assessment with the lesson objectives. So I cannot have a worksheet that talks about the water cycle, but in my content, the information in my content on my subject matter was all about how to ride a bicycle. So there is a discrepancy between the two. There's a total difference between the two. There's no alignment between the two. So at the end of the day, we must make sure that what the content entails, it aligns with the assessment that I will do. So the content and the assessment, I must actually pick up the content within the assessment. So with the intention of equipping students with meaningful and sustainable long life skills. Right. So a learner, when the learner have started to ride a bicycle, if manage it, that is a long life skill. When a learner have started to develop confidence within the class, and specifically those learners who do not have that confidence standing in front of other learners in front of the class, right? So you will gradually expose that learners first within a small group, then into a little bigger group, until you find that that learner has now the confidence to stand in front of the class and to do a speech. So that is a sustainability. So now you have grown that learner with a specific skill, and that is a long life skill. So that learner will carry that skill forever and ever, right? So backward planning, always say, the context, you look to the curriculum, you look to your objectives, and your introduction, and your main important question. So always, when you get to the end of the process, you have to reflect and see where are my strengths, where are my weaknesses, how can I improvise, how can I make sure that when I have experienced an incident within my lesson, how can I improve on that? So that is the other part of the backward planning sequence. And important feedback is very important, right? We cannot do assessment, but there's no feedback. We must at all times have feedback, whether it is written feedback or whether we do it orally. But there has to be, and the feedback. Remember, we try that our feedback must be developmental. We must not try to write off our learners. We must support our students. We must try to develop their ability, right? So that they are open to you as the teacher. They can feel at ease to ask you a question at any point of time. So that is when we say very, very important. Then we also have characteristics, must be appropriate. There must be a collective achievement. It must be prompt and timely, and it must facilitate development, right? So these are just characteristics when we do our feedback. They must be positive. I always say, please be positive when you write feedback in here. And if you're struggling with wording, we also have those emojis that we nowadays can put on to as a type of feedback, a smiley face, a struggling face, a cry out face. So those are the emojis that we can also use in our feedback. And you will be surprised that learners, they love it, they like it. And they will be so eager to see what kind of feedback did the teacher give this time. So those are the things that we have to consider when we do feedback. And remember, it provides the opportunity to close the gap between the current and the desired performance. If a learner has struggled in an assessment, after the feedback, it gives that learner confidence to do well in the second attempt. And that is the opportunity that our learners will have, right? So your role as an educator, we know in our SAYS document these roles: you are an assessor, you are a pastoral role, you are a scholar, you are a researcher. And because you are a teacher, you will forever learn. You are a long life learner. In your class, you manage your class. They are recording and reporting that you have to do. You become an administrator. You design your learning programs. Those lessons that you do every week or cyclical, and you are a facilitator of your learning. You facilitate the process of teaching in your class, and your learners participate. And at the end of the day, you become the specialist teacher. You become the expert of your content knowledge, right? And that is why, so as a lifelong learner, we must at all times read up, do reading as much as we can. And there we have also results and still about feedback. And that brings us to the end of our session. Thank you so much, students. It's just a guide. I will try to, in the next coming 2 weeks, to provide you with another session again, so that you will be abreast when we have to do the fourth assignment. Thank you very much.